Welcome to Nltv.
Good evening, everybody. We have a jam-packed, exciting program this evening for you. We will hear from the Board of Deputies President. We will also hear a little of the inside track about the new government of Israel.
Yes, that should be very interesting. As well, we continue with our HGSS book, Jewish Book Canon, with Rabbi Dr Belovski this week. And we go over to wish a Mazal Tov for a 70th wedding anniversary.
Yes, but before we do all that, of course, this week we are entering into a period of mourning on the Jewish calendar. This Sunday is going to be, well, the delayed 17th of Tammuz fast. 17th of Tammuz, I think many of us are familiar with the beginning of the destruction of the temple, the breach of the walls of Jerusalem. But that's, of course, not the first thing that happened in our history on that day. And probably even more famously was the golden calf. The golden calf made famous by the Ten Commandments. And there they are dancing around the golden calf, and Moses is coming down the mountain with the tablets. He sees them dancing and he smashes the tablets. That was the 17th of Tammuz, terrible day for our people. Moshe had to, of course, go back up, plead for mercy for the people, and then have a second set of tablets. The full atonement occurred on Yom Kippur. But the beginning of the story of the destruction that we only end on Yom Kippur is the 17th of Tammuz. This is really a terrible day for our people this coming Sunday. And it's a fast day, begins at the break of dawn and goes through to the nightfall.
Right. So up till now, we have a lot of celebrations. We did have a lot of bar and bar mitzvahs. We'll have a 3-week hiatus, and then we continue, God willing, going forward. So
we've delayed Freedom Day in this country till after the 3 weeks.
There you go. So you had an interesting conversation with Marie and brought along Adam Taub, our resident interviewee for Nltv.
Star interviewer, yes he is. And so let's go and hear what Marie van der Zyl had to say about her second term as the Board of Deputies President. Marie van der Zyl, welcome to Nltv, and Adam Taub, regular on Nltv. Thank you both for joining us today, and Mazal Tov, Marie, on your re-election as the President of the Board of Deputies. And we're here today to learn more about your vision over the next few years and what we can expect to see from the Board of Deputies in the coming months and years ahead.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I really appreciate that. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Adam, for really for offering once again to run the show today, to conduct the interview. I'm here to provide comments and feedback here and there, but really Adam will be running the show. Thank you, Adam.
Marie, first of all, it's really great to welcome you here. Thanks for making the time. We really appreciate it. Can I start off with sort of like a personal perspective? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what the attraction of the job of the President of the Board of Deputies is to you? Since I can imagine a lot of people watching it will be thinking that this is probably the job they would least like in their lives. So tell us a little bit about your background and why you would, why you enjoy the idea of being President of the Board of Deputies.
I come from South Woodford. I grew up in Wanstead and Woodford United. I went to B'nai Akiva and JLGB in my youth. So I was always someone that was involved in communal organisations. And I was in Waltham Forest Pipe Band, where I played the bagpipes, and I am the representative, the deputy today still for JLGB. So that is an honour. I'm a partner in a law firm, international law firm called INTS. I'm in the employment department, and I have specialised in employment law for about 30 years. My communal life started very, very late on. I'm a cancer survivor. I had thyroid cancer, which had spread in 2008, and I have paralysis of the left vocal cord. So I now speak from the stomach, but my rabbi when I was at, I'm also a member of West London Synagogue and Mill Hill United. My rabbi at West London and Simon Myers, the executive director, said that I should consider going to the Board of Deputies. It was full of elderly gentlemen at the time, and they said that I should try and become an advocate there. And that's something that really came from our cancer support group. So I became a deputy. I was elected to Finance and Organisation Division. I got very involved, and I went on the JLC Game Changers course. And that really was where my communal life took off. I was inspired there by Gerald Ronson, and I stood for election as a vice president, where I served as chair of defence and interfaith relations. And then Jonathan Arkwright didn't stand for a second term, and I stood and was elected as president. I'm very driven. I'm determined. I've got a real sense of social justice and community, and it's an honour to serve. The Board of Deputies President is the #1 advocate for the Jewish community in this country. We've been through some very difficult times.
And Marie will come on to those.
Yeah.
Let me, I've got quite a few sort of areas that I'd love to cover off with you, if it's okay.
Sure.
So let's start off with something which is on the Commission on Racial Inclusivity, which is something really, as far as I know, it's the first time it's ever been done. In April of this year, the board released the report by Stephen Bush that came out of its Commission on Racial Inclusivity in the Jewish community. And the commission heard testimony from all parts of the Jewish community. I mean, it's really quite amazing, the number of different witnesses who came before it. Tell me about how the report came about and what you think are the most interesting and important recommendations.
Well, thank you. I think this is a very, very important piece of work, as you've just said. And look, there were some very difficult days and weeks following the brutal racist murder of George Floyd, and societies on both sides of the Atlantic at that time faced a real reckoning about the treatment of Black people everywhere, and the undeniable reality of systematic racism and discrimination. And at the board of deputies, it was of course right for us to condemn this killing of George Floyd, but we couldn't stop there. And no community is immune from the scourge of prejudice. Ours is no exception. And as society as a whole sought to examine racial diversity, Black members of our own community, they came forward and they told us that whilst there were many wonderful things about being Black and Jewish, they experienced far too many instances of marginalisation, of discrimination. And other minorities then in our community also stepped forward, and they too said they'd had similar experiences. And we realised that calling for change in wider society, we needed to first see what was happening in our own community and to decide to improve things here. And we asked the eminent journalist Stephen Bush to chair the commission. We were thrilled that he agreed to take on something so unprecedented. He's been so amazing with his time. And this is, as you said, the first time that any national representative body of a Jewish community has come forward in this way. And I'm not aware, in fact, of any other minority in any country having done so. But the combined challenges of, defining the commission's terms, listening to witnesses, consulting our communal stakeholders, and producing deliverables is, of course, very heavily dependent on volunteers. And I am very proud that the community took ownership of the challenges. The report has got 119 recommendations in there, and we have seen a huge outpouring of goodwill.
When do you think you'll be ready to go forward with a sort of an action plan? Have you got a sort of date for yourself?
Oh, we're doing this now. It'll be in the next few months. But it's important that the action plan is right and that we consult with our communal stakeholders.
Let me then come on to another sort of, I wouldn't say marginalized, but another sort of aspect of our community, which are the Haredim. Do you want to have a comment? What is exactly the relationship between the Board of Deputies and the Haredim? Do you see yourselves as the representatives of the Haredim, or do the Haredim have their own representation? What is the relationship between the two?
Well, I think you know yourselves that the Board of Deputies isn't the representative body. I think you must appreciate that for the Haredim, because it doesn't have, well, it has actually got one Haredi deputy, which is the first time during my first term that we have got a member of the Haredi representative from South Tottenham Shore, which actually is in United Synagogue. Despite that, the relationship between the board and the Haredim is really good. Personally, I've always had interaction, because from my time as a vice president, I've dealt with the coroner, Mary Hassel. You will remember that she tried to institute a cab rank rule preventing speedy burial, and we've had a huge amount of lobbying, not only over the years. There was a court case, you'll remember, where that cab rank rule was declared discriminatory, but I'm afraid throughout the pandemic, and even I'm afraid in recent days, there are always going to be issues with her, which are ongoing. It's a very good relationship. We've had lots of government meetings during the pandemic. There are certain things that were, as we know, that were documented about social distancing that were not adhered to, but we've had lots of government meetings. I've also met with the Mayor of Hackney, and I'm also currently working with members of the Haredi community at the moment in relation to this very sad case out of Fixler case that's ongoing. So it's a very good constructive relationship. Let
me turn to a different subject, which is, I know you've been very involved in the campaign against anti-Semitism. Just give us an insight as to what it was like to be within that campaign. I mean, there must have been times where it was very touch and go. Was this going to be a success? Was it going to succeed? Was it going to entrench Jeremy Corbyn within the Labour Party? It must have been quite nerve-wracking to be in this campaign.
Look, there's no doubt that the community, including myself, we were all very shaken by, the potential that there could be a party of government being led, by somebody like Jeremy Corbyn. He brought anti-Semitism from the fringes of society right into the mainstream, and anti-Semites was certainly emboldened by his leadership, encouraged by his leadership, and under his leadership, the disciplinary process to deal with anti-Semites was completely inadequate. It was a very difficult time for the community, but the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission report, found unlawful interference, and that was and harassment. That was an absolute day of shame for the Labour Party. I even went on question time to make the views known for the community. It was very difficult, but we all stayed together. It was a very big effort, and I'm sure we were all absolutely relieved when the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson was elected, definitely.
Can I ask you then about the IRA definition? The IRA definition I know has been adopted by the board, and has been the board has been trying to ensure that it's adopted. Tell us a little bit about the campaign to get the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which includes issues around Israel, adopted by universities, political parties, and other institutions.
Yes, I mean, Jonathan Goldstein and I in 2016 made a statement. We've adopted the IRA definition on behalf of the community. It's a constant campaign, and also I have to pay tribute also to one of your other members, Moishe Kanter. I'm also chair of the Council of the European Jewish Congress. There's been a big international and European aspect of getting international institutions, other countries to accept the definition. And throughout the UK, that's in relation to councils, to universities. It's ongoing. I had many circumstances where we tried to get universities to accept the definition. It's been very, very challenging. There are universities and vice chancellors, for example, Professor Ed Byrne, who's addressed the Board of Deputies, that have been very, very supportive. But right now, it's a serious challenge on campus. We know that especially since the latest conflict, there's been a terrible unleashing of anti-Semitism, and there are going to be issues, I think, for many years. But that's a very big part of the board's day-to-day work in relation to councils and universities. And recent examples, Oxford University, for example, Bristol, have taken part in a virtual rally with Rachel Riley. It's endless, and it's something that we just have to keep going, and we have to work together and stay united as a community to face these challenges.
Final question, if that's okay.
Sure.
You've got 3 more years. What's your vision for the Jewish community at the end of those 3 years?
Well, can I say thank you for that question? And it really is a role. It's the absolute privilege of my life in carrying out that role. And the Jewish community really is my home. It's nurtured me. It's been the platform now which I build my life. And in my first term of president, I, as I say, tended to find myself involved with Jeremy Corbyn and Labour anti-Semitism. And thankfully, we're managing to work with the new Labour leadership on these issues. And they have a roadmap in the shape of the Board of Deputies' 10 pledges, where they agreed to follow those. And that work is ongoing. But we've seen that anti-Semitism in the Corbyn years has had deep roots, particularly among parts of the left, often outside the Labour Party. And for example, many teachers feel utterly abandoned by the union NEU as they face anti-Semitism in the workplace. We were all really shocked by the news that anti-Semitism training in the union was being organised by an activist who graffitied the walls of the Warsaw ghetto. And a big part of our work going forward in relation to continuing to tackle anti-Semitism is going to have to be in relation to relationships with the trade unions. And we've also seen anti-Israel protests spill over into anti-Semitism, with ongoing media conspiracy theories declared from the platform and calls to march on Marks and Spencer, and further calls, as I said before, to rape Jewish women and assaults. And online, I'm afraid, is the new front line in the fight against anti-Semitism. And we've been calling on the government, and we will do far more, to regulate social media companies, including making them adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. We're also going to be putting a lot more work into challenging media bias in relation to Israel. We will continue to engage with political parties, different faith groups, trade unions, universities, social media companies, and the police to tackle that evil. But we also need to continue to defend our religious freedoms. There are a number of committed activists and organised lobbies, such as the National Secular Society, who want to clamp down on Mila, Shechita, and even Jewish schools. And as a community, we need to continuously work to push back on these threats. But as well as tackling external challenges, we've got to celebrate a Jewish community that's even more diverse. We've talked before about the Haredi sector, that's a growing part of our community, and we have to make sure that they feel connected and respected by the wider community. And it's not just the right thing to do, but it's also necessary for the cohesiveness of our community. And we need to recognise we've always been a diverse community, even if we didn't in the past. And that's why I'm so proud. We've spoken before about the Commission on Racial Inclusivity in the Jewish community. And the chair of that, Stephen Bush, he absolutely pursued the correct approach, looking at serious issues, generating credible solutions, but there wasn't a witch hunt approach to any particular part of the community. And that's how I think the Commission's report has been really welcomed. And I look forward to promoting that and its implementation also over the next 3 years. Another area that we're having to wrestle with diversity as well, of course, is Israel, and the board will always support Israel. I am an absolutely passionate Zionist. My grandparents made Aliyah in 1969. I've always gone to Israel. My brother and his family are in Israel. My nephew's in the IDF. But we've got no time for anyone that says the world's only Jewish state is illegitimate in any way. And we absolutely mourn its losses. We're very, very proud of its achievements. We will be celebrating its many achievements. Booming tech sector, thriving cultural scene, a country of so many possibilities. And for the first time, the board will have a programme of work on education in relation to Israel for deputies. And we're also going to be organising a Board of Deputies mission for Israel. I would like to say...
Marie, I must tell you, in order to get all that done, I think you're going to have to be standing again in 3 years' time. You're going to need another 3 years to get all of that done. Marie, it has been such a pleasure to speak to you, honestly, and to hear. I think a lot of people have a vague idea of what the board does, but not a sort of a sense of the sweep of the range of issues that the Board of Deputies has to cover. And that's even before you get to the emergencies that all of a sudden dominate the headlines.
Absolutely.
So I'm enormously grateful for the work that you do and for the time that you have given us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And I look forward to coming to see you in person.
Lovely. We look forward to it.
So that was interesting to hear about her personal life and the future, her plans for the future for her.
Yeah, Marie has always been, she does a lot of great work throughout the community and a lot of behind the scenes work as well that I know of personally. We had the opportunity to be in Israel with Marie for the World Holocaust Forum last year. And really an extraordinary, wonderful woman, a great ambassador and leader for our community. Speaking of Israel, it's been quite the week and a half for Israeli politics. Who would ever have thought that a so-called right-wing nationalist prime minister keep-it-wearing prime minister would be there in a coalition government with an Islamist party? But kudos to them. This is fabulous, a true unity government, and let's hope it lasts. But today we are going to hear from Jason Pearlman, communication strategist, who has worked very closely with Naftali Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar over the years. Let's hear all about it. Jason Pearlman, welcome to Nltv TV. It's such an honor and privilege to have you back in the suburb, a kind of suburb boy, originally Sunderland, which is kind of our connection somewhat. And here with our number one star interviewer, Adam Taub. Thank you so much. And Jason has joined us. Jason, you are a communication strategist living in Israel, having made Aliyah and worked closely with some of the key players in the political scene right now. Recently retired President Rivlin, PM Naftali Bennett, and his member of the coalition, Gideon Sa'ar. So what an honor and privilege to have you here on Nltv TV, Jason.
Thank you very much.
So Jason, it is great to speak to you. I think we are second, third cousins or something like that. So we actually have a personal connection.
Right? Second,
I think we're second cousins. So do you want to just kick off and tell us a little bit about how the family is doing since you're a son of the suburb? Just tell us how everybody's settling in Israel. I know it's already been a while since you've been there.
Right. Well, I mean, I've been in Israel now for 15 years. I should say son of the suburb, maybe, but nephew of the suburb, perhaps more, because, or grandson of the suburb, because of course I grew up in the northeast of England, in Sunderland, and my late grandparents, Libby and Louis Taub, obviously, of blessed memory, were key figures in the community, and still so many members of the family still a key part there, and it's always been a second home. My parents, of course, Hilary and Meir, many of the viewers will know, now living happily in Israel, in Yerushalayim. I'm very pleased to say they're doing very nicely. They look forward to welcoming you all to visit when travel is a thing that we can actually do. And us here, we live in Modi'in. My brother also lives in Modi'in. And we have 3 wonderful children. Our eldest is 15, just now beginning to start his Bagrut, the Israeli A-level equivalence. And the youngest is 5, who's about to start school, which is some sort of equivalence here as well. And we have a bit, but please God, coming up as well. So it's interesting times on the family front and certainly on the political front as well.
So let's move on to the political front. We have just had the swearing in, or the arrival of Israel's 36th government. And what a government it is. I mean, we have not seen something like this ever in the history of Israel. It's an extraordinary result, the 4th of a series of closely fought matches over the last 2 years. And let's just focus for the moment on Netanyahu, because Netanyahu has been the longest serving prime minister now, I think 12 years consecutively. And by sheer numbers, Netanyahu should be home and dry. If you sort of do the maths in terms of the number of right-wing parties that have seats in the Knesset, you're talking 56 seats. Add to that religious parties, you're at 72. In theory, Netanyahu should be very comfortably ensconced in the prime minister's seat. So do you want to give us an insight as to what's been going on?
Well, the key reason why Netanyahu wasn't able to form a government was simply no one would trust him. You know, a bird in the hand is worth many, many in any bush that Netanyahu could put forward. The joke going around was, when is a rotation not a rotation? When it's a spin. Because that's exactly what he was offering. You know, this person can be first, that can be first, you can have this role, I can have that role. But ultimately, he's the boy who cried rotation, because no one was prepared to believe him. And a return to the elections, a return to a 5th ballot, which, you know, seemingly absurd. You know, we said after the first it was impossible that we would go to the second. After the second, we said it would be unheard of that we go to the third. But after the third, it was kind of predictable we go to the 4th, and we had to put an end to that horrific. Like, you know, there's that concept in Judaism of, if you do an Avera 3 times, it no longer feels like an Avera to you. Well, we're well over that, you know, threshold. Yeah. And so we see the emergence of a coalition, which is based, and I think it's worth understanding that Israeli politics traditionally has worked on the right to left axis, and it's worked on the religious to secular axis. But then we have this other axis, which is yes, Bibi, no Bibi. And I don't want to let our viewers think that we're talking just about the man, that we're talking just about Netanyahu. And when I say, you know, no one would trust his word, that certainly seems to be the case. But really, we're talking almost like about a Bibiism, a notion, a way of doing politics. And what unites this coalition is its stand against that tone, the narrative, the delegitimization of the other, the bullying tactic in the Knesset. Anyone who watched the swearing in of Prime Minister Naftali Bennett would have been squirming in their seat. And I can tell you, I spoke to, you know, for instance, a journalist in the Associated Press, and they have all over the world, they have live feed of the Knesset beamed into every AP office, and an internal chat system where people were sort of going, what the hell is going on in Israel right now? Guys, look at screen 3. This is insane. And it really was quite a circus and not a theatre, which is not what it should be.
So I want to come on to the coalition. Let me just sort of wrap up with Netanyahu. What do you think he's going to be like in opposition? Do you think he's going to remain at the head of the Likud? Do you think he's going to want to leave politics to make money, which is what some people are saying? Do you think he's going to be destructive in the role of opposition? I'm just interested to see how you think it might play out.
Well, anyone who tries to second guess Netanyahu has traditionally come off second best. So I won't do that. But without a doubt, he's a formidable politician. He's a formidable statesman. The damage he did internally to our society in Israel, I would hold him entirely responsible for. But on paper, he's a tremendous political figure on the world stage. He's in a bit of a dichotomy now, because on the one hand, it's his being there in opposition as leader of the opposition that actually keeps this coalition together. But I don't think that anyone can look at the situation and say anything other than he clearly still has a preference for power. The fact that the handover meeting between former Prime Minister Netanyahu and Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was less than half an hour, I think speaks to something that suggests that when you've been working for a number of years only for your own sake, and not for the sake of the country, then there isn't much to hand over when you step out of power. So as to what he does next, I think he will continue, certainly in the short term, maintaining his stronghold on the Likud. I think we might see primaries or not primaries, either way. He maintains his grip on the party. And I think we'll see him be a very staunch opposition leader, which, by the way, is great. Bring it on. You know, this is a democracy. We should have a strong opposition. It would be great to see the opposition function in a more kind of, party model that we're familiar with, perhaps looking at the UK system. So I wouldn't expect him to say, "Good, he's not gone. He's not gone." That's for sure.
No. I can't imagine him going quietly into that night. Let's turn then to the coalition, and let's start with Naftali Bennett, because Naftali Bennett's position is fascinating. Here he is now as Prime Minister. He has turned his back on the individual that he quite, happily has said in the past was his sort of idol as a young boy. And now there's an enormous amount of hatred which is being directed towards him as a sort of a betrayal of the right. And in fact, some of the rhetoric is worryingly similar to that was directed against Rabin, when he was looking to do a deal with the Palestinians, this sort of traitor, liar, and so on. What's your understanding? Give us an insight into Naftali Bennett.
Well, first of all, let's look at the irony of those accusations. It was not the left who gave away control over areas of Hebron. It was Netanyahu. It wasn't Labour that carried out the disengagement party. It was, what was born out of the Likud of the Kadima party and Ariel Sharon, and Netanyahu, of course, voted for the disengagement. It wasn't the left that did the deal where hundreds of, if not thousands of prisoners were released, who went on to carry out terrorist attacks against Israel. It was on Netanyahu's watch. Again, the same you could be saying from money into Gaza and the failure really to clamp down on Hamas's build-up as a military. So the idea that somehow Naftali Bennett as Prime Minister has betrayed the right-wing values is ironic and ludicrous. I'll go a step further. This government actually, if we look on an ideological point of view, is perhaps more right-wing actually than Netanyahu's government. And Netanyahu gave Justice Ministry, a key position in the Israeli political system, to the former head of the trade unions, Avi Nissenkorn. Under Naftali Bennett, it's Gideon Sa'ar, who I can tell you from personal experience is very staunchly on the liberal right and with justice as a key issue for him. And by the way, that speaks to a lot of the government. Many of the positions are held by people with actual experience and speciality in that area. Our new education minister has a doctorate in education. Shock, horror, what a novel idea. Our defense minister is a former chief of staff. Our environmental minister is a key figure in the Green Bloc. These are logical appointments. And actually, I think that the idea that there's some sort of betrayal ideologically is ludicrous. But to speak of Naftali Bennett specifically, anyone who looks at Israel, as I think many of the people that we may interact with on a daily basis do, only through the paradigm of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are going to be very confused by Naftali Bennett because he's a hawk and he's sitting in government with staunch leftists, and that seems very strange. But if you look at Naftali Bennett, as I saw him, as Minister of Economy, who went to Rahat and Hura and invested significant resources in building up the industry there for the Israeli Arab communities. If you look at him as the man who, as education minister, did tremendous amount of work to build the periphery and the Israeli Arab and ultra-Orthodox schools to help students achieve tremendous advancements in mathematics and English studies. If you look at him as the man who, with a modern Orthodox kippah on his head and leader of the right-wing nationalist religious party, went to Pittsburgh and stood side by side with his reform and conservative and liberal Jewish brothers from the community there in the hours after the massacre and said, Kaddish alongside them kind of thing, then you understand you're dealing with a man who has very much put unity and the well-being of the people at the center of what's going on here. And as far as the coalition, yes, it has voices all the way from Islamists through to maybe New Hope and far right-wing Israeli voices. Herzl is thought of as the father of Zionism, right? Well, why? You know, modern Israel looks nothing like Herzl's Israel. It looks more like a Chada Am's or Jabotinsky's, whatever. But Herzl is the father of Zionism because he got on with building the institutions and the foundations of the state. Today, we have been through a period of such poor governance and such neglect that we're almost down to the foundations. We need to rebuild the health system. We need to rebuild the education system. We need to rebuild the economic system for small businesses and self-employed. We're at such a basic level that we need to channel our inner Herzl as a government. And when we have the luxury of disagreeing on right and left issues, we will. But until that point, there's a lot to be getting on with. And Naftali Bennett has seen that and realized that and taken the responsibility to enact it.
So do you think what that means is that this coalition government is going to park a lot of the most controversial issues for which Israel, you'll be focused on Israel, and say, actually, we're a working government. We're here about society, economics, justice, wealth inequality, those sorts of issues, and that's where we can agree on, and let's leave the other issues to the side?
Again, if you're looking at the Israeli-Palestinian issue as the key issue, then you're sort of saying, oh, we're going to put aside the important issues. These aren't important. These aren't non-important issues. These are, you know, we haven't passed a budget in this country since, forget Corona, right? The bat that gave us Corona wasn't born the last time the state of Israel passed a budget. Okay, it's not anything to do with that. We didn't pass a budget because Netanyahu didn't want to put himself in a position we'd have to hand over power. And that budget means that, you know, my children who need extra help with Ivrit in school haven't been getting it because there's not a budget to provide that. Friends' children who have, you know, suffered significant illness and require occupational therapy aren't getting it because there's not a budget for it. And it's not, we can't work like that. When you're talking about, you know, existential issues, firstly, Iran, there's consensus on, let's just put that to the side. If you're talking about the Palestinian issue, then yeah, we have to park it because, for two reasons, by the way, not just because we don't necessarily have a consensus within the cabinet, within the government to actually make any bold moves, but more importantly, we don't have a partner on the Palestinian side anyway. So why should we curtail our everyday advancement and prosperity on the basis of the fact that someone else anyway isn't interested in talking to us about promoting the other side?
When we talk about parking the Palestinian issue, I think for those on the right, that means status quo, and that's okay. Doesn't that, I mean, those on the left who feel that the change is needed, doesn't that necessarily?
No, it's not status quo for the right. Just to understand how the situation really plays out. Israelis who live in Judea and Samaria, if they want to extend their balcony, they have to apply to the military, and they don't have the same access to resources, etc., as perhaps the Jewish communities or even the Israeli Arab communities who live within the Green Line. These are key issues that the right-wing government under Netanyahu neglected. Equally, we've seen Palestinian takeover over Area C, completely in contradiction of the Oslo Agreement and certainly, you know, any other understandings of cooperation with the Palestinians. Netanyahu's government neglected those. We've seen a number of key issues on the right that the status quo is not acceptable. So I don't want to say, you know, the right wing are happy, just let it carry on as it is. There are very key issues on the table from an ideological right wing point of view that need to be addressed with. And some of them will be, for instance, the splitting of the role of the Attorney General. We have a bizarre situation in Israel where the Attorney General in the morning gives the Prime Minister legal advice and then in the afternoon prosecutes him in court. It's bizarre. It's utterly bizarre. So you need to split that role, right? You need a Crown prosecutor and a legal advisor to the government like you would have in other systems. We don't have that here. It's one person. So there are, and that's a particular right-wing policy that needs to be promoted, and that is being addressed in this coalition. That was one of Gideon Saar's key conditions of entering. So, and as Justice Minister, a key priority for him. So there are compromises on both sides. There really are. There are compromises on both sides. On the left, absolutely. Hats off to Yair Lapid. He's done a tremendous job of putting the country first and his own ego to the side. But equally, for Naftali Bennett as Prime Minister, we're making significant concessions on the right wing as well. So it's a unity government pretty much in every sense of the word.
If I just pick up on the point that the rabbi is making, I think it's this, that from the right wing, it turns around and they go, okay, we realize we're making concessions and so on in order to do this. Although, of course, you've got the settlement that was just built at Eviatan during this last period, which is already becoming a controversial issue. But on the left wing, there's a feeling that every day is a problem for us. Every day we are being forced to control the lives of people whose we would rather not be controlling, and that it is morally corrupting for us as a country. I think that's the issue. In other words, there isn't quite a balance between right and left. On the right, we go, okay, there's a temporary halt, we get it, we've got to do it, there's a compromise and so on. On the left, there's a feeling, and you see it reflected across the diaspora, that we are in a crisis and we need to address this issue.
Again, you see, I think this speaks to the point that we don't really look at the situation necessarily through the same lenses. I don't believe, and I may be wrong here, but I don't feel, as someone who finds himself in the right camp, that the everyday burning issues of the Israeli left in Israel is focused on ending occupation, ending the presence of Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. I don't believe that's the everyday burning issue. I think that there are many more internal issues which take center stage. And they take center stage for the reasons that I spoke before. Firstly, because there is no Palestinian partner to work with whom to work. And we've done this once, right? We did the disengagement from Gaza. We know what happens, right? The people of Tel Aviv have just spent, 2 weeks in bunkers as well. Not that it compares to what the life of those in Sderot and Ashkelon go through, but it was a harrowing experience for the bubble of the state of Tel Aviv, as they call it. So I don't think that is necessarily is considered such a key concession as much as maybe other issues of religion and state, of maybe judicial policy and balance of powers between legislature and the judiciary. So I understand what you're saying, but I think that speaks much more to Israel's relationship with the diaspora than it does necessarily between right and left in Israel.
Okay,
Can I jump in on religion and state? Certainly, that's an issue as far as some of those who haven't made it into government this time around are concerned. How much leeway is there for a new government to come in, shift policy in a certain direction, and then does that put it into law forevermore, or then does it just switch back when the next government comes in?
Well, that's always the case. There are elements of legislation that will swing back left and right. We see it in the UK, we see it in the US, we see it in Israel too. We just haven't seen it over 12 years because Netanyahu has maintained power. Okay, it's a very interesting point, religion and state. I think there are two aspects to this which need to be separated. For the ultra-Orthodox community, especially looking at this from their angle, it doesn't really affect Yossi and Bnei Barak if Yair in Tel Aviv can marry not according to Jewish law. Because Yossi and Bnei Barak's children are all going to marry Kedat Moshe Yisrael, according to their Rav, according to their traditions. It doesn't really affect Yossi in Bnei Barak if Chani in Haifa is eating non-kosher meat. Ideologically, spiritually, we all understand that notion of Am Echad B'Lev Echad and Kol Yisrael Ha'avim Zo Lazeh, and we want to, from a religious perspective, with a kippah on our heads, we want to see the customs that have kept us a people for generations and centuries maintained and not harmed. But equally, this is an issue of civil rights, and civil rights are also a key part of the two luchot are divided, the Ten Commandments divided into Ben Adam Lamakom, between man and God, and Ben Adam Lachavero, between man and man, and there should be a balance between the two. So there are aspects that want to be advanced by elements within this coalition that perhaps would be problematic for the ultra-Orthodox from an ideological point of view. Where does it really matter to them is the budgets, right? Where does it really going to hit them is if suddenly budgets get cut from yeshivot and kollels, etc., or there's dramatic changes in the education system against their will. And I would argue that firstly, there's been a general understanding that status quo will be maintained on the sensitive issues of religion and state, except for maybe a few areas where there have already been agreements in the past that just haven't been enacted, such as a compromise to army enlistment, which is a key area. Also, something to do with the Kotel platform, access for liberal streams to areas around the Western Wall. But the key issues of things like, Shabbat as a state day of rest, etc., will probably remain, or most likely remain, status quo. And beyond that, Naftali Bennett, as Prime Minister, said from the plenum in the Knesset, and indeed Avigdor Lieberman as Finance Minister, has agreed with the framework of the coalition agreements that they're not going to single out the ultra-Orthodox community, the Haredi community, for budget cuts. There may have to be budget cuts because we've got a deficit of historic proportions, but that's not just going to affect them, it's going to affect everybody. So I would worry less on issues of religion and state. And in fact, I would seek to calm tensions, because when the leader of the ultra-Orthodox party stands up and tells Naftali Bennett to take his kippah off, I think we come back to talking about Beid Adam L'Chavero and how we relate to our fellow man and treating each other with respect, and altering that tone in politics, which I spoke about Netanyahu's political entity at the beginning. I think we understand more the direction that we're going to be dealing with when we come to religion and state.
Talking about religion, let's talk about another religion, which is Islam. In this coalition, for the first time, we are seeing both the Joint List and Ram, which is ostensibly an Islamist.
No, not the Joint List. Not the Joint List, just Ram.
Oh, is it just Ram? Forgive me. Okay, so we've got Ram, which is a sort of an Islamist party. How does that fit? Well, first of all, why have they joined, and how does it fit into a coalition?
Listen, this is where it gets interesting, right? Firstly, it's worth understanding, of course, that Israel has 25% of its population, roughly, is Arab. Okay, they're not Palestinians. They may identify as Palestinians, but citizenship-wise, they're citizens of the state of Israel. They pay taxes. They pay and receive national security. They are citizens to every purpose. Not all serve in the army. Some do civil service as a voluntary experience, but they don't automatically serve in the military, although many do. There is a number that do. Some community do, especially the Bedouins, Druze do, as a matter of course, serve in the Israeli IDF. So we're talking about representatives of some of that community, almost actually like the Haredi Muslim community, that's who Ram represent. So, for instance, they're very against LGBT rights, which also doesn't fit so nicely in this coalition, because even voices on the right are fairly in favor of promoting more equality when it comes to the LGBT community. But we're talking about a population here that has suffered something really worrying in the past few years, which is a wave of destruction caused by organized crime. We're talking about horrific figures of honor killings of women in the community. We're talking about real lack of resources and infrastructure, both law and order, building police stations, but also roads and towns and expansion in that sense, natural expansion of the growth of the community. So for Ram and for Mansour Abbas, he had the opportunity, and he played the political game very well. He could have done it with Netanyahu, he could have done it with the change bloc and the new government that we've seen, and indeed this is a conversation that he and Netanyahu, it seems, have actually been carrying on for a number of years. He has the opportunity as a leader of his community to really deliver. And these aren't things that, as a right-wing Israeli, I have any problem with. I want to see law and order established in mixed cities. I want to see Israeli Arabs have equal access to resources. Right? This is pure Jabotinsky. The Arab Israelis, the Arab citizens of the state, should have equal access to the resources of the state. That doesn't affect the character of the nation as a Jewish state. It doesn't affect my identity as a Jewish Israeli. In fact, it promotes it. And this isn't anything that contradicts. So he's got an opportunity, especially in such a narrow coalition where every vote counts, to really leverage that power for the good of his community. He didn't sign on symbolically to Israel as a Jewish democratic state, and I understand that. But he has signed on to support a coalition which has the opportunity to really do some good for people and his community especially.
Okay. Just one last thing on the coalition. The number of women in the coalition seems to be, quite remarkable. The number of women in government.
Not only that, we're seeing senior positions in the civil service also being filled by female leaders. This is Arab ministers. We've got female Arab members of Knesset now. I think that's a first in the Zionist party. I think in the Labour Party. There's some real progress towards equality on these sorts of issues. I know that there's an organization a friend of mine works with called the Devorah Forum, which works to promote women in the security and political echelons as well. Naftali Bennett's Prime Minister has just appointed his senior policy advisor is a lady called Shimrit, who's a former journalist. We're going to see some real progress in that sense. I think the cabinet. I actually can't remember the numbers. I think there are 9 female ministers.
Shaked, you've got Yifat Shasha Biton,
Merav Michaeli. I think there are 9 in the cabinet. It's not equal. It's not 1-to-1, but it's significantly progress.
Yeah. Let's turn to America. We have a new president in the United States. Under Netanyahu, Israel became really quite partisan in its approach, which had never previously been. Biden definitely seemed to kick back against that. But now we have a new prime minister, a new government. Do you see a sort of a new relationship with the US?
So the dynamic between President Biden and Prime Minister Bennett, I believe, will go down in history as one of the most interesting in history. With the greatest of respect to President Biden, he is a man of more advanced years. With equal reverence to Prime Minister Bennett, he is under 50 still. Prime Minister Bennett is from the right, yet has voices ostensibly further to the right of him, very angry with him at the moment. President Biden comes from the left and equally has voices further to his left, who are critical of him as well. So they both come from really opposite ends of this spectrum, but where does their Venn diagram meet? They both come to power at a time when their countries need real healing, both in terms of Corona and that period, and also just in terms of the narrative and the electoral cycle that we've both been through. And they both have genuine political dedication to the idea of unity within their peoples. And so it could be fascinating to see how they come together on the key issues that we face today, on any future with the Palestinians, and indeed, perhaps more pressingly, the issue of the Iranian nuclear ambitions. There is added to that, no doubt, that Prime Minister Bennett does not come with the baggage that Netanyahu had. I say that with a bit of tongue in cheek because there was a great story that Netanyahu used to take his laundry to Blair House to have it done when he would go to America. So certainly Prime Minister Bennett does not come with any baggage when it comes to his relationship with the White House. And I think the fact that we saw within hours of his inauguration a phone call from President Biden after already a tweeted cable. And I think the fact that we saw within hours of that the appointment of a permanent ambassador shows that the American administration is ready to work very seriously with the Bennett administration in Israel, the unity government, the administration in Israel. And again, I think that speaks to the change in tone. I think that there's an understanding that we have people who can be trusted and will stand by their word. And ultimately, when you're dealing with international law and politics, that's one of the most crucial factors.
So let me then talk about changing relationships, the changing relationship with the diaspora. Looking from the diaspora, we've already hinted the fact that the diaspora sees Israel through a very different lens to the way Israelis view the issues that are pressing for them. We have seen a really noticeable shift in the way that the diaspora is thinking about Israel. In particular, the younger generation, the next generation, looks at Israel quite differently. It's affected very much by media and social media as well, and the way that Israel is presented, in particular in relation to the Palestinian issue. You've seen the rise of organizations like we've had in this country. We've had Na'amot, which ran Kaddish for Gaza back in 2014. And some of the most active young people now are on the far left, sometimes you might call it the hard left, that are really opposed. Is Israel worried about its relationships with the diaspora? Is it concerned about the way things are going? Certainly under Netanyahu, it didn't feel that way. He seemed to be much more concerned about Christian Zionists than he was about Jewish Zionists abroad. What do you think is the future of Israel diaspora relations?
This is an interesting issue to unpack. The first thing I would say is that Naftali Bennett, as Prime Minister, has a great record as diaspora minister when it comes to issues like the Kotel Plaza, for instance. He actually, as Jerusalem minister before that, was actually responsible for establishing the Jerusalem, the plaza at the Kotel for liberal prayer, egalitarian prayer. So he has, you can see a sort of track record of trying to find the compromise between the further right, when we're talking about religious voices, and the more liberal communities. So I think notionally, there should be, for voices that feel there's a monopoly on Jewish practices when it comes to Israel, a hope of a more open approach and a more accepting approach. The other side to it is that Netanyahu did what he did, crucially, because he was held over a barrel by the ultra-Orthodox parties. He needed them to stay in power. He absolutely infiltrated their electoral bases to the point where they need to support him through hellfire and brimstone now, or they lose electoral weight. And we saw, an absolute joining of Netanyahu axis and the right to left axis when it came to religious issues. You've got obviously people like Victor Lieberman, who was right wing but secular. So there are examples where that isn't the case. But I would say that the relationship with the diaspora needs to be addressed almost away from Israeli politics, pretty much for that reason. And I think that it's a good time in that sense to pay tribute to outgoing chairman of the Jewish Agency and incoming president of Israel, Buzzi Herzog, who has done a tremendous amount, both with resources to invest, but also with political movements and public statements to promote understanding. And I'll also give credit to Naftali Bennett, who, as diaspora minister, didn't just invest in helping Jews abroad understand better Israel. He also invested tremendously in Israelis understanding better Jews abroad. Programs like Gesher, etc., where they take leaders in Israeli public opinion, journalists, industry captains, etc., and they take them to America and they tour them around the Jewish communities in UK as well, and they meet their fellow co-religionists and realize the gulf that actually exists between them and understanding. There was actually a program on TV, I believe it's available on YouTube. I have to confess I haven't watched it yet, so I must do, with Guri Alpha, an Israeli kind of stand-up comedian almost, going around. I think it's called The New Jew. Yehudi Chadash. He goes around America and meets, female rabbis, all these things that are completely out of the Israeli psyche. And I think that speaks to a general trend of a wake-up in Israeli society, that there is a need to connect better with diaspora. When it comes to the diaspora relations with the government, though, and I want to separate this thing, the relationship between Israelis and Jewish communities abroad and the official institutions and the official institutions of the state, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done for two reasons. Firstly, I don't think that we have done enough to explain to the Jewish communities abroad the reality of the security situation on a day-to-day basis. I don't think that the average Jew in England or the US really appreciates quite the necessity of the security infrastructure that we operate. And I also don't think that we have immunized them enough to understand that the images of that infrastructure and the narrative that it creates in the media is not balanced. I remember as a child growing up knowing that the BBC took an anti-Israel point of view. Now, I've now worked in politics and with the media for 15 years, and I can show you times that the media have actively taken an anti-Israel point of view. And by the way, there are many times that I don't think they have, but I can show you instances where the media have actively disregarded the Israeli concerns and placed their entire emphasis on the Palestinian concerns, whether it be in their reporting by images or whether it be in their reporting by words. So I think that we need to do a lot more to explain ourselves better in general, not just the Jewish community, but especially Jewish community, because we owe them that. We owe them that. But at the same time, and I suppose this would be my plea to the communities abroad, is don't just follow what you're hearing around you. Understand that the day-to-day narrative even between Israelis and Palestinians, is vastly different to the day-to-day narrative between those who purport to support Israel and Palestinians abroad. The concept of what it means to be an Israeli today in the army, or a reserve dutyist, or just a mother at home with a child who has to know where his bomb shelter is, I think doesn't make it through. It doesn't overcome the Palestinian suffering, which I don't disregard, but it doesn't justify in the minds of those looking in from abroad the seriousness that Israel has to take its security.
So, understand. And what's interesting, Jason,
that's key to it.
What seems to me that you're saying, which is critical, is that communication is absolutely essential, that you've got to communicate better, which means if all's well, you will have work to do for the next 30 years or however long you intend to be in the business of communication strategy. And we hear your plea clearly. We hope everybody out there who potentially might employ you will also hear it as well.
Can I add one thing? I want to add one thing, which I know is something that people will have picked up on reading about Prime Minister Bennett in the press. He'll have been referred to in every paper you will have read as ultra-nationalist, right? Now, let me explain why. In Israel, we have two camps. We have the peace camp and we have the national camp. But that doesn't mean that the peace camp don't believe in Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people. It doesn't believe that the national camp don't believe in peace. And it's really important to understand that when I talk about Israel and a nationalist opinion of Israel, it's not the same really as, neo-Nazism in Europe or something, God forbid, or Germany or France. It's important to understand that when I talk about nationalism, it's in relation to an alternative approach. And both sides want peace. A hawk and a dove both want peace. The argument is how to get there. And I think we have to remember that when we're reading these things, because it's so easy to get swept away in what these words mean in other contexts without understanding that Israel is very unique and has a very specific context when it comes to the use of these highly inflammatory political terms.
And Jason, I have to tell you that also the scene itself in Israel is so complex that it's often difficult for diaspora Jews to grasp it. Just looking.
Well, I have a solution for them. I have a solution.
Come to Israel. Come to Israel.
Come and live there. You'll be very welcome at home.
Jason, thank you so much for your time. Really invaluable insight, and we wish you well and the family.
Thank you, Jason.
And to everyone at home. Be well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Adam Taub is amazing. He really knows how to ask the right questions, and it's such a natural when it comes to interviews. We're really blessed to have him as part of our community and to be able to join us again on Norsley TV. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. We can't thank you enough, really, for all your support, generosity of time and spirit. And I know how much you put into preparing these interviews. And you give it your all. Thank you.
Absolutely. He had the list of all the cabinet members and make sure to know how many women were there. And it was very interesting. I mean, Jason brought quite a few insights into what it would look like now that Naftali is taking on such a diverse government. And I think that's important. We are a diverse people. And especially in the state of Israel.
B'hatzlacha to the new Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett. And now we have our regular feature of the Anglo-Jewish canon. We feature this every week or two, a prominent member of the community.
So let's go over to Rabbi Belovski to hear what he has to suggest.
Hello, I'm Harvey Belovski, Senior Rabbi of the Golders Green Synagogue, and my Jewish book recommendation is Moshe Halbertal's Maimonides, Life and Thought. You can see it there. Halbertal is Professor of Jewish Thought and Philosophy at the Hebrew University, and he's probably the world's leading academic expert on the Rambam. It's absolutely superb, a book that won the 2013 National Jewish Book Prize for its English translation in the scholarship category. Why am I recommending this book? Well, it's comprehensive, perhaps the biggest recent study of the Rambam, his life, the development of his ideas. It's also a brilliant exposition of the tensions between the philosopher and the halachist, what we used to call in our yeshiva days, the conflict between Rabbi Rambam and Dr. Maimonides. Perhaps most memorably, it investigates the Rambam's self-understanding, his halachic positions, his position as a primary philosopher and thinker, and the influences that various Arab philosophers had on his thinking, his life as an antinomian, someone who really feels that religion should be the life of the mind, not necessarily of the body, and that the halachic system might allow people eventually to go beyond the physical. But for me, one of the most significant parts of Halbertal's study is the conflict in the Rambam's own writings about whether he intended his halachic code, the Yad, to be a replacement for the Talmud or not. In some places it seems that he was absolutely clear, read my book, abandon the Talmud, and this will be the one book. In other places it's less certain. But whatever you do with that idea, of course, which will never be resolved, it puts the Rambam in a context, an understanding of a most unusual thinker with a very high degree of self-awareness, a man who recategorized and rethought almost every aspect of Jewish law and belief, a man who is without question the most influential Jewish thinker of the last 1,000 years. And Halbertal has written the most influential book about this man. Buy it and read it.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Belovski. You know, Rabbi Belovski has a long history with the shul. You know, we get to hear from him each year in our Suda series, which has now once again begun. Yes. I mean, we had last week Rabbi Livingstone, and this past Shabbos we had Rabbi Danny Kirsch. And we are up and running again.
We were fortunate enough to join a 70 wedding year anniversary. It's amazing, with a 98-year-old.
Wow.
It was his birthday as well. Alfred and Thelma, who are members of HGSS, long time, you know, members of the community.
They've been married longer than I've been born.
So let's go over and see a little bit of the celebrations that they did during these, during these trying times. They managed to, put something together, the children, and really a shout out to the caregiver, Abby, who did an amazing job organizing it all.
It's going in the Norris Leader.
Norris Lead TV now. We went, and we could put on Norris Leader as well. So we have Michelle and Paul here, children of Thelma and Alfred Huberman, on the anniversary. Amazing! Wow, 70 years. So you guys...
70 years of marriage, and today my dad is 98. So big Mazal tov.
Big Mazal tov.
And I'm 60 on Saturday. Shall we just get that
so
one in?
So we're getting the party out going. So Michelle, I know you're involved with the Sephardic community very much, right?
Harif, yes. I'm the creative director of Harif.
Right. And vous parlez français aussi?
Oui, bien sûr. Je suis partie de le groupe...
Du groupe français.
Je comprends.
Il y en a toujours qui parlent français en Angleterre. So your parents are doing well. It's very nice. So they've been members, I know, of the show for quite some time. Your mom has been...
Absolutely, forever. My mum was born in the suburb. She grew up in the Meadway. Literally, what number did she grow up?
70-something.
Near Kingsley Way. She grew up there. We used to live, when we were little, in Lindonley. And I think before that, they lived in Gurney Drive, didn't they? Gurney Drive, Lindonley, Meadway Court.
So they did a little bit of rounds of the suburb.
I've been bar mitzvahed in the shul.
You've been bar mitzvahed?
I've been married in the shul.
Oh, beautiful.
I've had 2 bar mitzvahs in the shul.
Excellent. And now an anniversary. Wow, that's great. Rabbi, are you going to say a little blessing? Or should we do some blessings?
Sure, absolutely, Mrs. Huberman. Mazel tov on this wonderful, wonderful occasion. 70 years together, 98th birthday, till 120 in good health.
Beautiful. You're all on Norris Lee TV. This is our Shul TV channel. Say hello. Okay, thank you all for coming. Okay. It's always fun to have a simcha, and even outdoors, even from way above, and and like I said, we're starting to see those coming out. It was really wonderful to attend a few bar mitzvahs. We had a mazel tov to the cantor, who really went above and beyond decorating the shul with flowers galore. It was unbelievable. We've never seen the shul.
Breakfast for everybody in the shul, and a special gift for every child at Karam.
Absolutely, really very generous. The kids didn't know what to do with themselves. A beautiful box, and really a contribution. So thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's been wonderful to have you part of Norris TV once again.
See you next time.
We'll see all of you in the East End tomorrow for our walking tour.
Yes, that's right. Looking forward to seeing that. Have a wonderful week. All the best.